My husband told me to stay quiet and call an Uber while I was in labor so he could fly to Scottsdale, then came home to find his wife and everything else gone. The phone rang at 10:58 on a Sunday night. I let it ring twice before I answered. I already knew what he was staring at: the kitchen island on Alderbrook Court and one sealed envelope with his name on it in my handwriting. My son was 2 days old, asleep on my chest, his fist curled against my collarbone like he was holding on to something. Dalton yelled before I even said hello. "What is going on?" I looked down at Levi. His breathing was even. Mine wasn't. Not quite, but I kept my voice level anyway. 4 years of marriage teaches you how to sound calm when you don't feel it, and 7 months of watching a man choose his mother over me had turned that particular skill into something closer to instinct. "I'm doing exactly what you told me," I said. Silence on the other end. I could hear the house behind him, the particular echo of a kitchen with nobody in it. Then his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since his grandfather's funeral. "Harper." Just my name, like it was a question he didn't have the rest of. I didn't answer right away. I let him sit in it. Behind him, I could hear footsteps on hardwood, quick ones. And I knew Vivian was in the house too, that she hadn't dropped him at the curb and driven off like a normal mother-in-law would after a 5-hour flight. I closed my eyes and waited for whatever came next. I want to tell this in order, because order is the only thing that made any of it make sense to me while it was happening. When you live inside a slow betrayal, you don't get the clean narrative. You get a Tuesday that feels a little off, and then a month later, another Tuesday that feels the same way. And it isn't until you line them all up afterward that you see the shape of what was actually happening to you. So let me line them up. To understand why I let that silence stretch as long as I did, you have to go back further than that Sunday. You have to go back almost a year to a lake house on Indian Lake and a shoebox of photographs nobody was supposed to open. He proposed 18 months later on a Tuesday. No restaurant, no crowd, just the two of us on my apartment balcony with a ring he'd clearly bought without asking anyone's opinion but his own. I loved that about him then. I didn't understand yet that it was one of the last decisions he'd make that way. We got married the following October, and even the wedding carried a small warning I filed away without examining too closely. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Vivian called the venue directly and had the seating chart redone without telling either of us, moving my grandmother, who was 81 and hard of hearing, to a table near the speakers so that a cousin of Dalton's could sit closer to the head table instead. I found out the day of from the coordinator, who assumed I'd approved it. When I brought it up to Dalton in the church parking lot, 40 minutes before I was supposed to walk down an aisle, he told me it wasn't worth fighting about on our wedding day, and he was right, in the sense that timing makes almost anything not worth fighting about if you let it. I let it go. I was 25 and in love, and I told myself that in-laws did things like this, that it meant nothing, that I'd chosen my husband, not his mother's seating preferences. I didn't yet understand that the pattern doesn't announce itself as a pattern. It just keeps showing up in slightly different clothes until one day you're standing in a hospital room counting how many times you've seen it before. I was 29 when Levi was born. Dalton was 33. We'd been married 4 years, together 6, since a mutual friend's wedding in Cincinnati, where he spilled red wine on my shoe and apologized so sincerely, I gave him my number just to make him stop. I worked as a senior contracts compliance analyst at Bramwell Steel Components in Moraine, Ohio, reading fine print for a living, flagging the clauses nobody else caught. Dalton sold orthopedic hardware for Ferris Orthopedic Group, hips and knees, and the occasional spine kit, territory covering Southwest Ohio and into Kentucky. He was good at his job. Good enough that every June, Ferris flew its top performers to Scottsdale for something called President's Club. 5 nights at a resort near Camelback Mountain, spouses invited. Dalton had never once brought me. 3 years running, he'd brought his mother instead. The first year I told myself it was a fluke, that Vivian had asked, and he hadn't known how to say no to her. The second year I stopped believing that. The third year I stopped asking about it at all, because asking led to the same conversation every time. The one where he told me I was reading too much into a work trip, and I ended up apologizing for bringing it up. Vivian Voss was 62, a retired dental hygienist with a talent for making generosity feel like a transaction. She loved her son with the specific, suffocating intensity of a woman whose entire identity ran through him. Walt, Dalton's father, was quieter, a retired systems engineer who'd spent 30 years at Wright-Patterson doing contract work and seemed to have spent that same 30 years learning not to interrupt his wife. I liked Walt. I never quite figured out how to like Vivian, though God knows I tried for 6 years. The incident that should have told me everything happened the August before I got pregnant, at the Voss family lake house on Indian Lake. We were up there for Labor Day weekend, and Vivian had asked me to help move furniture out of the back bedroom closet to make room for an air mattress. I found a shoebox on the top shelf, the cardboard soft with age, full of photographs from the 90s. I was flipping through them when I found one that stopped me. A woman, dark-haired, maybe 30, holding a newborn in a hospital room. On the back, in faded ballpoint, Renata and Mara, Miami Valley, April. "Who's this?" I asked, holding it up. Vivian's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went still, then hard, like a door swinging shut behind her eyes. She reached over and slid the photo out of my hand before I'd even finished the question, careful not to bend the corners, the kind of practiced gentleness that told me this wasn't the first time she'd had to retrieve something like it. "That's Foster's ex-wife," she said. "We don't really talk about her." Foster was Walt's older brother, Dalton's uncle, a man I'd met exactly twice at holidays, and who never stayed long. long. He usually left before dessert, always with a reason that sounded rehearsed: a headache, an early morning, a dog that needed letting out. I asked a follow-up question, something harmless, just wanting to know how old the baby in the photo was, whether she was a cousin of Dalton's I'd never met. Vivian didn't answer. She took the whole box out of my hands, all of it, not just the one photograph, and set it on a shelf high enough that I'd have needed a step stool to reach it again. Walt had been standing in the doorway the entire time, a stack of folded lawn chairs under one arm, and I remember the particular stillness that came over him, the way a man goes quiet when he's watching a conversation he's had before and knows exactly how it ends. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the box, and then at his wife, and then he set the lawn chairs down and left the room without a word. I remember thinking it was strange, the whole exchange, the speed of it, how thoroughly the subject got closed before I'd even understood there was a subject to close. I remember thinking it for exactly as long as it took Vivian to hand me a stack of paper plates and ask if I'd mind setting the table, her voice back to its normal, bright register like nothing had happened at all. I let it go. That was my first mistake, if I'm being honest about mistakes. I had good instincts, and I overrode them because keeping the peace felt easier than following a hunch about a woman I'd never met. By the time I got pregnant the following spring, I'd mostly forgotten about Renata and Mara. I had other things to think about. Dalton was thrilled when the test came back positive, genuinely thrilled, crying in the bathroom doorway in a way that reminded me why I'd married him in the first place. For a few months, things were good. He came to appointments. He read the books, or claimed to. He picked out a crib, a convertible one in white oak, and put it together himself over a weekend, cursing at the instructions the whole time while I sat on the nursery floor and laughed at him. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like he was always the man he became. He wasn't. He drove 40 minutes each way to my 20-week anatomy scan and cried again at the sight of the ultrasound, and on the drive home he talked, unprompted, about what kind of father he wanted to be, the specific kind, present at dinner, coach of a rec league team someday, someone his kid could actually talk to. I believed every word of it. I still think he believed it too, in the moment he said it. Something shifted around the 7-month mark, and I didn't see it shift because I was too tired and too pregnant and too busy trusting him to notice the ground moving under both of us. The first real crack came 7 weeks before Levi was born, on a Tuesday night in April. I was sitting on our bed timing contractions, while Dalton sat at his mother's 63rd birthday dinner across town. I called him at 7:22, pain coming every 12 minutes. Tight bands across my lower back that made it hard to breathe through. I could hear the restaurant behind him, silverware, his mother's laugh. "It's probably nothing," he said. I heard Vivian ask him something in the background, and he laughed at whatever she'd said before he'd even finished the sentence to me. "Braxton Hicks, probably. If you're really worried, just call an Uber." I called him back twice more over the next 20 minutes. Once when a contraction bent me forward over the bathroom sink, and once when I couldn't get a full breath in until it passed. He answered the second call annoyed, not worried, and told me his mother had just brought out the cake. Could I please just get a car if it was that bad? He'd be home by 10. I didn't argue. I've thought about that a lot since, why I didn't argue. And I think the answer is that some part of me already knew arguing wouldn't change anything, and I didn't want to spend my energy losing a fight I couldn't win. A stranger named Hector picked me up 9 minutes later. He was maybe 50, drove a gray Camry with a pine tree air freshener, and a photo of 2 kids clipped to the visor. And when he saw me wince in the rearview mirror, he asked if I wanted him to skip the speed bumps on Far Hills. I said yes. He skipped everyone. When we got to Miami Valley Hospital South, he parked in the drop-off lane, came around, and walked me all the way to the doors with his hand hovering an inch from my elbow the whole way, ready to catch me if I went down. A man I paid $9 and a 5-star rating took better care of me that night than my husband did over the phone. It turned out to be false labor. Dalton came home at midnight smelling like steak and red wine, and when I told him what had happened, he said I needed to stop panicking over every twinge, that I was going to wear myself out before the real thing even started. I didn't cry. I did something worse. I believed him. I told myself he was probably right, that I was the anxious one, that this was just what late pregnancy did to a person. It would be months before I understood that the version of events where I was the problem was one he'd been building, brick by brick, since long before that phone call. 2 weeks after that, I found the second crack, and this one I couldn't explain away. I was using our shared tablet to look up a recipe when a company email notification slid down from the top of the screen. Dalton's Ferris orthopedic account, still logged in from when he'd used it to check his mileage reimbursement. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that, because I know how it sounds. But the subject line said PTO balance confirmation, and something made me tap it before I could talk myself out of it. He had 2 full weeks of paid parental leave sitting untouched, banked, and available, effective the moment Levi was born. He hadn't scheduled a single day of it. What he had scheduled 3 weeks earlier, without telling me, was 4 vacation days spanning June 8th through June 11th, labeled in the internal system as family trip, Scottsdale, AZ. My due date was June 10th. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything. When I finally asked him about his leave plans that night, over dishes, keeping my voice as neutral as I could manage, he told me he hadn't decided anything yet, that it was too early to plan around a due date that could shift by 2 weeks in either direction. He said this while looking me in the eye. He said this knowing I had already seen the confirmation email with his name on it and a start date circled in the company's own internal calendar. That was the night I made a folder on my laptop. I named it Reference, nothing more dramatic than that, and I started saving screenshots. The PTO confirmation, the date, the timestamp. I work in contracts for a living. I know the difference between a verbal promise and a piece of paper that can be verified later, and some part of me, the part that had been quietly cataloging inconsistencies for weeks without admitting it to myself, understood that I might need paper before this was over. I tried once more, privately, before it became a family matter at all. A week after I found the confirmation email, I sat him down at our kitchen table on a Thursday night and asked him, calmly, without accusation, whether he was planning to use any of his parental leave when the baby came. He told me he hadn't decided, that Ferris was short-staffed in the territory and it wasn't a great time to be gone for weeks. I asked why then. He'd been able to schedule 4 vacation days over my due date without a second thought. He went quiet for a second too long, and then he told me I was twisting a work trip into something it wasn't, that his mother had already booked her flight, and it would be a whole thing to change it now. That I was, and this was the phrase he used, making everything so much harder than it needed to be. I remember sitting there with my hand on my stomach, feeling Levi shift under my palm, and understanding that I had just watched my husband choose the path of least resistance, with his mother over the path of least resistance with his own child. He didn't apologize. He got up and rinsed his plate and asked if we had any of the good coffee left for the morning, like the conversation had already ended, somewhere I hadn't agreed to end it. At 37 weeks, his family made it official. We were at his parents' house for Sunday dinner, pot roast, the good china that only came out for occasions, and Vivian announced the trip like she was reading a press release. 5 nights at the Montelucia, top performer package, and this year, her eyes flicked to my stomach and back up, quick as a blink. This year, it would just be the 2 of them, since some of us wouldn't be able to travel anyway. Those of us who can travel, she said, and smiled, and passed the green beans. Nobody at that table said anything at first. Walt kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his pot roast into smaller and smaller pieces he didn't seem interested in actually eating. Dalton's cousin Marissa, who I liked more than most of the family, shot me a look across the table, quick and apologetic, the kind of look that says I saw that too, and I'm not going to be the one to say it out loud either. Dalton reached over and put his hand on my knee, which I understood even then wasn't comfort. It was crowd control, a signal meant to keep me quiet rather than a gesture meant to make me feel better. I gave him one full breath to say something, to correct his mother, to acknowledge out loud that the flight landed on the 9th, and I was due on the 10th, and that maybe, just maybe, 4 days away from a woman, 37 weeks pregnant with their first child wasn't the strongest plan he'd ever made. He didn't take it. What he said instead was, "It's only 4 days, Harper. You'll have Bree." That night, after we got home, his phone lit up on the nightstand while he was in the shower. I wasn't looking for anything. It was just sitting there, face up, and the preview banner was impossible not to read. A text from Vivian. "Don't let her guilt you into changing your plans. She'll manage." Below it, a small blue thumbs up. He had liked the message. Not responded to it, not pushed back, not even ignored it. Liked it. The way you'd like a photo of someone's dinner. A small automatic gesture that told me everything about which side of that conversation he'd already chosen, without ever discussing it with me at all. I met attorney Grace Sullivan 4 days later. I'd found her name on a list a coworker sent me 18 months earlier, back when a friend of a friend went through a bad divorce, and I'd saved the number in my phone under a fake contact name, Gina Salon, just in case Dalton ever scrolled through my recent calls. Grace was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, 19 years of family law behind her, and the first thing she did when I sat down across from her desk was not ask me what he'd done. She asked, "What do you want?" Nobody had asked me that in months. Not what I was worried about, not what he'd said, not how I was holding up. What I wanted. "I want this clean," I said. "I don't want a war. I just don't want to be blindsided anymore." She nodded like that was the right answer. The answer she heard from the people who actually made it through these things intact. She explained that in Ohio, filing for legal separation before the birth would protect my insurance coverage and establish a paper trail without requiring me to prove fault or drag anyone through the mud. And she said it the way a person explains something they've explained 100 times before, patient, unhurried, like there was no version of this conversation that could rattle her. Then she gave me the rules, and I remember them almost word for word because I wrote them down the second I got back to my car. No draining joint accounts, no dramatic exits, no confrontations that could later be spun as instability on my part. Just documents, quiet, and receipts. Judges don't care about who yelled louder, she told me. They care about what's on paper. He's going to say I blindsided him, I said. He's going to say I did this to punish him for a work trip. Grace leaned back in her chair, unbothered, like she'd heard some version of that sentence 1,000 times before. Let him say it. You're not going to argue with him about it. You're going to let the PTO confirmation and the vacation dates argue with him instead. Paper doesn't get defensive. Paper doesn't cry on the stand. You let the paper do the talking, and you save your voice for your son. I didn't fully understand that day how much that one piece of advice would end up shaping everything that came after. I understood it by the time it was over. I started building my paper trail the same week. I found a townhouse on Persimmon Lane, a 15-minute drive from the house on Alderbrook Court, and signed the lease under my own name using money from an account Dalton didn't know I still had, a leftover savings account from before we got married that I'd never bothered to close. For 3 weeks, I moved out one bag at a time, a load of laundry that never made it back into my dresser. A box of books shifted to the trunk of my car on a Tuesday during my lunch break. My winter coats, my grandmother's jewelry box, The framed photo from our wedding that used to sit on my nightstand. Dalton noticed none of it. He was traveling twice that month for work, and on the weeks he was home, he was on his phone or asleep by 9, and the slow bleed of my belongings out of that house happened entirely beneath his notice. Bree helped with most of it, showing up on her lunch breaks in her school lanyard with an empty tote bag and a grim, efficient energy that reminded me she'd once helped our mother pack up an apartment in a single weekend after our parents split. She never asked me if I was sure. She just asked what was going in the car that day. One afternoon, folding my clothes into a suitcase on the bed I still shared with Dalton 4 nights a week, she paused and said, "You know he's going to say he never saw any of this coming." I told her that was exactly the point. A man who can't see his own house emptying out around him for 3 straight weeks isn't a man who was paying attention to begin with, and I didn't need him to see it coming. I needed him to understand it was already done. I left one thing untouched on purpose: the crib. I left it standing exactly where he'd built it, white oak, mobile clipped to the rail, because some part of me wanted him to walk into that room one day and understand, all at once, what he'd been too distracted to see happening in real time. At my next OB appointment, I asked Dr. Monroe's office to mark my chart private, visitors restricted to an approved list. My sister Bree went on that list. Bree was 26, taught 3rd grade at a school 15 minutes from my new address, and had been quietly furious on my behalf since the false labor phone call in April, though she'd been patient enough not to say I told you so, mostly because she hadn't told me so. She'd just watched and waited for me to catch up to what she'd already noticed. Dr. Monroe didn't ask many questions when I requested it, just made a note in my chart and told me, gently, that she saw more of these requests than people would think, especially in the last month before a due date, and that I shouldn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation for wanting to control who was in the room when I met my son. It was the first time in weeks a medical professional had talked to me like the decision was entirely mine to make, and I sat in the parking garage afterward for a full 10 minutes before I could drive home. Dalton's name did not go on the approved list. Neither did Vivian's. The morning he left for Scottsdale, I was 8 days from my due date and moving like a woman carrying a bowling ball in a sling. I'd slept badly, the way I had most nights that final month, and I remember standing in the bathroom mirror at 6 that morning studying the shape of my own face, tired in a way that had stopped being about lack of sleep and started being about something closer to grief I hadn't let myself name yet. Dalton was already up, laying out clothes for a 5-day trip like it was a task he'd rehearsed, checking the weather app for Scottsdale instead of checking on me. His suitcase rolled right past the hospital bag sitting by the front door, the one Bree had helped me pack 2 weeks earlier, and he didn't so much as glance at it. "The due date is just an estimate," he said, more to his phone than to me, checking that he'd packed his charger. Outside, Vivian's SUV gave 2 short honks from the driveway, impatient, and Dalton kissed the air somewhere near my cheek without actually making contact. "Stay quiet and call an Uber," he said, "if anything happens." He said it like it was a kindness, like he was leaving me a plan, a contingency, evidence that he'd thought of me at all. He didn't wait for me to respond. He grabbed his bag and jogged out to the SUV, and through the front window, I watched Vivian lean across the console to say something to him, both of them laughing at whatever it was before he'd even gotten his seatbelt on. I said, "Okay." He thought he'd won. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The second the SUV turned off Alderbrook Court, I called Grace. "File it," I said. By 2:15 that afternoon, the legal separation petition was filed and served through the process that would reach him electronically within the week, regardless of what state he was standing in. I sat on the porch steps for a while afterward, not triumphant, just tired, watching a neighbor mow his lawn like it was any other Tuesday. By 9:07 that night, real labor started. 5 minutes apart, no confusion this time, a pain that didn't ask permission and didn't care what anyone's calendar said. Bree drove me in. She counted my breaths the entire way, the same rhythm a stranger had once counted for someone else's wife on a Tuesday in April, and I remember thinking, somewhere between contractions, that it had taken a $9 Uber ride and my little sister running red lights on Wilmington Pike to show me what being taken care of actually felt like. At intake, the nurse pulled up my chart on her screen and paused. "Charts marked private," she said. "Approved visitor list shows one name." Bree raised her hand like she was back in her own classroom, and the nurse waved us both through. Levi was born at 3:42 in the morning, 7 pounds, 1 ounce, furious and perfect, a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the whole delivery room. Somewhere in Arizona, his father was asleep in a suite with a mountain view, 400 miles closer to a golf course than to his own son. By noon, Dalton posted a photo to Instagram, poolside, drink in hand, his mother beside him in sunglasses, caption reading family time. His son was 11 hours old in that moment. Vivian tried calling the maternity ward that afternoon and got nowhere. No confirmation, no denial, just the particular silence of a hospital system, doing exactly what I'd asked it to do. It wasn't cruelty, it was a boundary, built the only way I had left to build one. 11 missed calls came in over the course of that afternoon and evening. I went back through them later, once things were calmer, and counted. Not one voicemail asked whether the baby was okay. Not one asked whether I was okay. Every single message, when I finally listened, circled back to how upset Vivian was, how this was going to ruin the trip, how I needed to think about what I was doing to this family. Bree Bree sat on the edge of the hospital bed while I played them, her jaw getting tighter with each one, and by the fourth voicemail, she reached over and just took the phone out of my hand, gently, the way you'd take something sharp away from a toddler. "You don't have to listen to the rest," she said. "I already know what they say. They all say the same thing." She was right. I turned my phone face down on the hospital tray table and spent the rest of the afternoon doing something that felt, for the first time in months, like exactly what I was supposed to be doing. I watched my son breathe. I was discharged 2 days later, on a Saturday, and moved into the townhouse on Persimmon Lane with a 2-day-old and a diaper bag Bree had restocked twice already. That was the night I got a message that changed how I understood everything that had happened over the previous 7 months. It came through Facebook, from a name I didn't recognize at first, Renata Ashworth, a small profile photo of a woman in her 50s standing in front of a lake that wasn't Indian Lake. It took me a second to place her. Then I remembered the shoebox, the hospital photo. Renata and Mara, Miami Valley, April. A mutual friend, a cousin on Walt's side who followed both of us, had mentioned in a comment thread that Dalton's wife had just had a baby while he was out of state. That was all it took to reach Renata. Her message was careful, almost apologetic, like she wasn't sure she had the right to say anything at all. She said she'd been Foster Voss's wife for 6 years, that she'd had her daughter Mara 15 years earlier, and that in the weeks after Mara was born, Vivian had orchestrated a family trip that pulled Foster away during Renata's postpartum recovery. "The same way," she said, almost verbatim, "the same way it sounds like she just did to you." Renata explained what happened next in a way that made my stomach drop, her voice steady but slower now, like she was choosing each detail carefully so I'd understand the weight of it without her having to say the weight out loud. She hadn't documented anything. She hadn't had a Grace Sullivan, hadn't known to keep records, had trusted that the people around her would eventually see what she saw. Instead, Vivian and the rest of the family had spent those weeks quietly building a narrative that Renata was unstable, overwhelmed, difficult. The kind of story that's easy to build around a postpartum woman nobody bothers to actually ask how she's doing. By the time the marriage ended, Foster had been coached to believe he was the reasonable one, and Renata walked away with far less custody time than she should have, because on paper, all anyone had was his family's version of events, told loudly and often against her silence. "I'm not saying your husband is a bad person," Renata wrote. "I'm saying his mother has done this before, and it worked, and nobody in that family has ever had to answer for it. Don't be quiet. Whatever you do, don't let them make you the quiet one in this story." I sat with my phone in one hand and Levi in the other for a long time after I read that. I thought about the sealed envelope on the kitchen island. I thought about the folder on my laptop labeled reference, 40 screenshots deep by then. I thought about Grace Sullivan telling me, on day one, that judges don't care who yelled louder, they care what's on paper, and I understood for the first time that I hadn't just been protecting myself out of instinct. I'd been protecting myself the way Renata never got the chance to. The photograph in that shoebox hadn't been an odd family footnote. It had been a warning, sitting on a high shelf for a year, waiting for me to be ready to understand it. I did eventually write back, 2 days later, once I'd had time to sit with it and stop shaking every time I reread her message. I asked if she'd be willing to talk on the phone, and she called that same evening, while Levi slept in the bassinet beside me and the townhouse hummed with the particular quiet of 10 o'clock at night with a newborn in the house. Her voice was warmer than I expected, a little tired around the edges in a way that told me this wasn't easy for her either, dredging up 15 years of something she'd clearly spent a long time trying to set down. "I almost didn't message you," she admitted. "It felt strange reaching into a family that closed the door on me a long time ago, but I saw the timeline of it, the trip, the baby coming while he was away, and I couldn't not say something. It was too close to what happened to me." She told me the details slowly, like she was handing them to me one at a time to make sure I could carry each one before she gave me the next. Foster's Scottsdale trip back then had actually been a different city, a family reunion in Michigan that Vivian planned for the same week Renata was due with Mara, and when Renata objected, Vivian had told the whole family, gently, sympathetically, that Renata was being controlling, that she didn't want Foster to have any life outside their marriage. By the time Mara was 6 weeks old, that story had hardened into fact inside the family. Repeated so many times it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like something everyone had always known. Renata didn't have screenshots. She didn't have a lawyer who told her to save everything before she needed it. She had her own account of what happened, against an entire family's version, and in family court she told me, that isn't a fair fight. "What finally happened?" I asked her, even though some part of me already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. "I got Mara every other weekend for the first 4 years, Renata said. "It took until she was in kindergarten and old enough to say things in her own words before a judge started taking me seriously again. I got more time back eventually, but I lost 4 years I'm never getting back, because I didn't think to protect myself from people who were supposed to love me." She was quiet for a second. "You did the thing I didn't know I was allowed to do. You didn't wait for them to be fair. You just started documenting, and you left before they even realized you'd gone. That's not cold, Harper. Whatever anyone in that family tells you, and believe me, they will tell you. That's the smartest thing anyone in this situation has ever done." I didn't write back to Renata that night we first spoke, at least not with anything more than thank you. I forwarded her message to Grace the next morning instead, along with a short note. "This is happening happened before. I have a name, and now I have a witness to a pattern, not just a single bad week. Sunday night, his flight landed. I let the phone ring twice before I answered. Levi asleep on my chest in the townhouse he didn't know existed yet. "What is going on?" he yelled, standing, I would learn later, in a kitchen that had already told him everything it needed to. Empty cabinets where my mugs used to be. A closet with his clothes and nothing else. One envelope with his name on it, sitting exactly where I'd left it. "I'm doing exactly what you told me," I said again, because it was true, and because I wanted him to hear it twice. Silence. Then his voice cracked. "Harper." I heard him move through the house, footsteps on hardwood, toward the hallway, toward the nursery, toward the crib I'd left standing on purpose. "The crib's still here," he said, quieter now, like all the anger had run clean out of him in the space of a few seconds. Then the only question that actually mattered came out of him, small and cracked in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Is the baby? Did you have him? Is he okay?" I looked down at Levi, sleeping like he'd already won something none of the rest of us had figured out yet. I opened my mouth to answer, and that's when I heard another voice pick up somewhere behind him, sharper than I had ever heard it. "Give me that phone right now, Dalton. She does not get to decide what happens to that baby." Vivian. She'd come inside with him. Of course she had. There was a scuffle of sound, the phone changing hands, and then her voice came through clear and close, like she'd pressed it right up against her mouth. "Harper, you listen to me. This is a Voss baby, and you do not get to hide him from this family because you're feeling some kind of way about a vacation. He's my son," I said. My voice didn't shake. I'd practiced this, in a manner of speaking, every night for 3 weeks while I packed boxes nobody noticed leaving the house. "He was born while you two were at a pool. You don't get to walk in 11 hours after the fact and tell me what he is to this family." "You are being hysterical," Vivian said, and I heard Dalton, somewhere behind her, say her name, low, like he was trying to pull her back from a ledge she'd been standing on for years without ever once looking down. She didn't stop. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that worries me about you as a mother. Honestly, cutting people off, hiding a baby. It's not normal, Harper. It is not." I marked my own chart private at 38 weeks pregnant because a text from you told my husband not to let me guilt him, I said. "That's not hysteria, Vivian. That's a woman who read the room correctly. You've just never been on the losing end of it before." "Put Dalton back on," I said. There was a pause, and then his voice again, quieter, further from whatever fight had just been happening in that kitchen. "Harper, please. Can I see him? Can I just see that he's okay?" "You can see him through my attorney," I said. "Her name is Grace Sullivan. You'll be hearing from her office tomorrow if you haven't already. I filed for legal separation the afternoon you left. I have documentation going back to April. I have your PTO request. I have the text your mother sent you the night before you flew out, and the fact that you liked it. I am not hiding him from you, Dalton. I am done being quiet so that you and your mother can decide what version of this family gets to be true." He didn't say anything for a long moment. In the background, I could hear Vivian saying something else, sharper, and I could hear him say, muffled, like his hand was half over the phone, "Mom, stop, just stop." And something in the way he said it told me this was the first time in his life he'd ever told her that, and meant it. "I want to see him," Dalton said again, into the phone, and something in his voice had dropped every last trace of the man who'd checked a charger while his wife stood 8 days from her due date. "Please, then you'll see him the right way," I said. "Through my lawyer, in writing, on the record." I paused, and then I said the thing I'd been building toward since a Tuesday night in April, when a stranger named Hector walked me into a hospital because my own husband wouldn't. "You told me to stay quiet and call an Uber. I did exactly what you asked. You should enjoy the quiet, Dalton, because that's the last thing you're going to get to decide for me." I hung up. Levi stirred against my chest and settled again, and I sat in the dark of a townhouse he'd never seen, and for the first time in 7 months, the silence in the room belonged entirely to me. I didn't sleep much that night, not out of anxiety exactly, more out of a strange, buzzing alertness, the feeling of having finally said out loud a sentence I'd been rehearsing since April without knowing it. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to feed Levi, and I sat in the nursery chair I'd bought for the townhouse, a second-hand glider I'd found on a resale app for $60, and I looked around at a room that had nothing in it Dalton had ever touched. No crib he'd built with his own hands, no mobile he'd hung crooked and never fixed. Just a room I'd assembled myself, piece by piece, over 3 quiet weeks, and it struck me that this was probably the truest thing that had happened to me all year. Not the filing, not the phone call, not even Levi's birth. Just a woman alone in a room at 2 in the morning, realizing she'd built something entirely her own without asking anyone's permission to do it. The next real test came 10 days later. At the first supervised exchange Grace had arranged, a neutral drop-off point in the parking lot of a pediatric office in Centerville, chosen specifically because it had cameras over every parking space and a receptionist who'd agreed to note the time if anyone asked her to. Dalton arrived alone, which surprised me. Vivian arrived 4 minutes later anyway, uninvited, parking 2 spaces down and getting out before I'd even finished unbuckling Levi's car seat. "I just want to see him," she said, coming around the front of her car too fast, and I saw Dalton's face do something complicated, caught between his mother and whatever he was trying to become. "I'm his grandmother, Harper. You can't keep doing this. This isn't your exchange," I said. "It's his." "You have turned my son against his own family," Vivian said, louder now, loud enough that the receptionist glanced up through the office window, loud enough that a woman loading a toddler into a minivan 2 rows over stopped and looked over too. too, her hand still on the car door. You planned this the whole time, didn't you? Filing behind his back while he was gone. That's not a wife, that's an ambush. I filed the day you told me at your own dinner table that some of us weren't able to travel, I said. I kept my voice even, the way Grace had coached me to, because I understood by then that Vivian needed me to raise mine. Needed a scene she could describe later as hysterical, and I wasn't going to give her one. You didn't leave that room without an audience either, Vivian. Ask any of the people who were at that table what they heard. She opened her mouth to say something else, and Dalton, for the first time in the entire 7 months I'd been watching him fail to do it, put his hand on his mother's arm and said, "Mom, that's enough. Get back in the car." She stared at him like he'd slapped her. He didn't take it back. The receptionist, I found out later from Grace, had made a note of the time and a brief description of what she'd overheard, unprompted, because she said it wasn't the first tense exchange she'd witnessed in that parking lot, but it was the first time she'd seen a grown man tell his own mother to stand down. Vivian got back in her car. She didn't apologize, but something had shifted, visibly, in front of witnesses who had no reason to take my side, except that they'd watched it happen with their own eyes. And that was the moment I understood the confrontation had never really been about winning an argument with Dalton on the phone. It was about making sure the truth stopped living only in my memory and started living in other people's too. The weeks that followed didn't move like a single dramatic event. They moved the way most real endings do, in a slow scatter of phone calls and paperwork and people quietly deciding where they stood. Grace's office sent formal notice to Dalton's attorney within 2 days, and along with it, an itemized accounting of a $22,000 transfer Dalton had made from our joint moving and nursery fund 6 weeks before Levi was born. Money that turned out to have covered Vivian's flight, her share of the Montelucia suite, and the difference between his economy ticket and a first-class seat he'd upgraded to without mentioning it to me. He'd used our son's furniture money to buy his mother a better seat on a plane. When Grace laid that number out next to the PTO confirmation and the screenshot of the liked text message, Dalton's attorney stopped arguing about custody logistics and started talking very quickly about a settlement. Family sides got chosen fast and not always the way I expected. Bree obviously never left mine, showing up at the townhouse most evenings with groceries and an opinion about whatever Vivian had posted that day. What surprised me was Walt. He called 2 weeks after Levi was born, his voice careful, and asked if he could come by. I almost said no. Then I thought about him standing in that lake house doorway a year earlier, looking at a shoebox and saying nothing, and I decided to give him the chance to say something now instead. He came alone, without Vivian, and he brought a gift for Levi, a small wooden rattle he said he'd carved himself, the same kind he'd made for Dalton 33 years earlier. He sat at my kitchen table and told me, haltingly, that he'd known about Renata's message before I had, that Foster had called him the day it went out, furious at first, and then, by the end of the call, quiet in a way Walt said he hadn't heard from his brother in years. I should have said something back then, Walt told me, turning a mug of coffee around and around in his hands without drinking from it. About the lake house, about the box. I've had 30 years to learn how to stay quiet in that house, and I'm not proud of it. He looked up at me then, and for a second I saw where Dalton's better instincts might have come from, buried under 30 years of practiced silence. Vivian isn't a monster either, if that means anything. She's just never once in her life been told no and had it stick. I let that happen. Foster let that happen. I think in his own way, Dalton was always going to let it happen too, until somebody finally made it impossible for him not to notice. He didn't ask me to forgive Vivian. He didn't even really ask me to forgive him. He just wanted Levi to know someday that not everyone in that family had looked away. Vivian did not take any of it quietly. She called 11 more times that first week, and then, when I stopped answering, she filed a request for grandparent visitation rights before the separation had even cleared its first hearing, a move Grace described with something close to admiration as legally premature and emotionally predictable in equal measure. When that didn't work, she showed up at the townhouse unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon with a gift bag from a boutique in Kettering, ringing the bell 3 times before I answered through the security chain. She told me she just wanted to see her grandson, that this had all gotten so out of hand, that families should be able to work things out without lawyers. I told her, as calmly as I could manage with a 6-week-old asleep down the hall, that she could see Levi through the visitation schedule Grace and Dalton's attorney were still negotiating, and that showing up at my door was not going to move that process along any faster. She left the gift bag on the porch and posted that same evening a long message to Facebook about grief and being cut off from her family that a dozen relatives commented on with prayer emojis before Foster, of all people, replied with a single line, "Ask yourself why this keeps happening, Vivian." It only got 7 likes, but I noticed every one of them. There was a night, about a month in, when the grief caught up with me in a way the anger hadn't allowed for. Levi was finally asleep in the bassinet beside my bed, and I was going through a box I hadn't unpacked yet and found our wedding album, still wrapped in the tissue paper from the printer. I sat on the floor of the townhouse and looked at photographs of a version of Dalton I still honestly missed. The one who cried in a bathroom doorway over a positive pregnancy test. The one who cursed his way through building a crib on a Saturday afternoon while I laughed at him from the floor. That man hadn't been a total fiction. He'd existed, at least sometimes. And I let myself cry for him the way you cry for someone who's actually died, because in a lot of the ways that mattered, he had. I didn't cry for long. I put the album back in the box, and I checked on Levi, watching the small rise and fall of his chest in the dark, and I let myself sit with the strange, doubled feeling of grieving a marriage while being more grateful than I'd ever been in my life for the one thing that had come out of it. I went to bed. Grief, I was learning, didn't need a schedule. It just needed to be let in once in a while so it didn't come back louder. The financial and legal pieces took another 4 months to resolve. The house on Alderbrook Court sold in August, and per Grace's calculations, factoring in the $22,000 that had funded a trip I never took, my share of the proceeds came out meaningfully larger than a 50-50 split would normally have allowed. Dalton's attorney tried briefly to argue that Ferris Orthopedics President's Club trip counted as a business expense rather than marital spending, until someone on their side apparently looked up the itinerary and found a full day blocked off for a couple's spa package that had never once in 3 years of Vivian attending in my place included a second Voss. Dalton's attorney tried briefly to argue that Ferris Orthopedics President's Club trip counted as a business expense rather than marital spending, until someone on their side apparently looked up the itinerary and found a full day blocked off for a couple's spa package that had never once in 3 years of Vivian attending in my place included a second Voss. Grace forwarded me that email exchange with a single line of her own commentary above it. This is the kind of thing that ends negotiations early. She was right. Within a week, Dalton's attorney stopped contesting the characterization of the transfer entirely and moved straight to discussing numbers. And within 3 weeks, we had a settlement neither side felt the need to drag into a courtroom. I remember sitting in Grace's office the day we signed it, Levi strapped to my chest in the carrier Bree had bought me, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not victory, exactly. More like the specific relief of finally setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I was still carrying with both hands. Custody landed on a standard shared schedule once Dalton demonstrated, over several supervised visits and then unsupervised ones, that he could actually show up when he said he would. He wasn't a monster. I want to be fair about that, even now. He was a man who'd spent his whole life letting his mother make his decisions for him, and it took losing his wife and nearly losing his son to make him start making a few of his own. Word got around at Ferris Orthopedic faster than either of us expected, though not because I told anyone. Dalton's regional manager, a woman named Priyanka Deshmukal, who'd flown out to Scottsdale herself that June, had apparently spent the whole trip assuming Vivian was Dalton's aunt, and only learned the truth when Dalton, 3 weeks into the separation, requested his backdated parental leave and had to explain, in an HR meeting, exactly why he was asking for it 11 weeks after the birth instead of before it. I heard about the meeting secondhand through a mutual contact of Bree's who worked in the same office park, and the version that came back to me was that Priyanka had gone very quiet, then asked him, in front of HR, whether he understood how that timeline sounded out loud. He didn't get fired, he didn't get disciplined, not officially, but he lost the top slot on his sales team that quarter to a colleague he'd normally have beaten easily. And I noticed, the following June, that his name wasn't on the President's Club list at all. I won't pretend that didn't feel like something. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was consequence, and for months I hadn't been sure the world was going to hand him any. Vivian's Facebook posts kept coming through that summer, a slow drip of vague, wounded language about ungrateful daughters-in-law and families torn apart by pride, and for a while I let them get under my skin more than I wanted to admit. What changed it was watching how her own family started responding. Foster's single-line comment was the first crack, but it wasn't the last. A cousin I'd met exactly twice quietly unfollowed her. An aunt who'd always seemed close to Vivian sent me a private message out of nowhere, just a handful of sentences saying she'd watched this exact pattern play out with Renata all those years ago, and had regretted ever since not saying anything when it counted. Nobody organized a rebellion. Nobody needed to. It turned out a lot of people in that family had been quietly keeping their own private ledger of Vivian's behavior for years, waiting, the way I once had, for a reason to finally believe what they'd already seen with their own eyes and talked themselves out of trusting. The supervised visits, over that first summer, told their own story too. The first few were stiff and short, 45 minutes in a family room at the pediatric office. Dalton holding Levi like he was afraid of him, checking his phone twice before the visit monitor gently suggested he put it away. By August, though, something in him had loosened. I watched, once, through the observation window Grace's office had access to for the transition period, as he lay on the floor making Levi laugh with nothing but his own exaggerated sneezes, over and over, until Levi's whole small body shook with it. I felt something complicated watching that. Not longing exactly. More like relief that whatever else had gone wrong between us, my son was going to get to know a version of his father that could still make him laugh like that, even if I never had to live inside that version's decisions again. Levi turned 1 this past June, the same month his father's President's Club trip rolls around every year, and I'd be lying if I said that timing doesn't still land with a little weight every time it comes back around on the calendar. We had a small party for him at the townhouse, a handful of balloons taped crooked to the porch railing, a cake Bree helped me decorate badly with a frosting piping bag that kept giving out on us. Walt came and stayed the whole afternoon, and got down on the kitchen floor to show Levi how to stack blocks without knocking them straight back over out of impatience. Dalton came too, for 2 hours in the middle of the party, brought a present that was actually age-appropriate for once, and left when his time was up without making it into a bigger moment than it needed to be. A year earlier, swear I couldn't have imagined a version of that afternoon that felt as unremarkable, as almost boring as it did. Boring, it turns out, was the whole point. Boring was what I'd been trying to build the entire time. Dalton has him every other weekend now, and to his credit, he's never once missed a pickup, arriving on time with a car seat installed correctly and a diaper bag actually stocked. Small things that shouldn't feel remarkable and somehow still do. He didn't go to Scottsdale this year. I heard through Bree, who still hears things through the Kettering grapevine whether she wants to or not, that he told Ferris he'd be taking his parental leave retroactively as personal time off instead, a year late and for a reason that no longer required my presence to matter. I don't know what to do with that except notice it. Vivian and I speak maybe twice a year, at handoffs, in sentences short enough to fit inside a doorway, both of us carefully polite in the specific way of two people who've agreed, without ever saying so out loud, not to give each other anything more to work with. She still posts things occasionally about family and forgiveness, and the children who forget where they came from. I've stopped reading them. Walt sees Levi more than she does these days, brings him little carved things, has never once, in over a year, tried to explain his wife's side of anything to me. Renata and I still message sometimes. Her daughter Mara is 17 now, and doing well, and Renata told me once that hearing Levi was born and healthy was the first time in 15 years that story had ended somewhere other than where hers did. I think about that more than I probably should. Last spring, Renata and Mara drove up from Columbus for an afternoon, and I watched a 17-year-old girl who'd never met me before that day hold my son on her lap in my living room like she'd been waiting her whole life for a version of this family that actually worked out, and in a strange way, maybe she had. Renata sat across from me on the couch and said very little, just watched her daughter and my son together, and at one point she reached over and squeezed my hand, once, and didn't say anything at all, and I understood that some things don't need the words attached to them to land exactly where they're supposed to. I live in the townhouse on Persimmon Lane still, though I've since bought it outright, and I've hung the wedding photos I once cried over in a box marked donate, because keeping them didn't hurt anymore. It just meant something had happened, once, and didn't need to be erased to be over. Levi has Dalton's eyes and my stubborn chin, and most nights it's just the two of us. And most nights that's more than enough. He started saying a handful of words now, most of them nonsense. One of them, unmistakably, Mama, and I still haven't figured out how to describe what it did to me the first time I heard it. Here's what I understand now that I didn't understand at 37 weeks pregnant, sitting on a porch step after filing paperwork I hoped I'd never actually need. Being quiet was never the same thing as being fine. I spent a year mistaking my own calm for peace, when really it was just me making myself smaller, so somebody else's comfort could take up all the room in a marriage that was supposed to have space for both of us. I used to think love meant absorbing things quietly so nobody else had to feel uncomfortable. I don't think that anymore. I think it just meant I was easy to build a story around, the reasonable one, the flexible one, right up until the story didn't need me to be reasonable anymore. It needed me to disappear into someone else's version of events entirely. Dalton told me to stay quiet and call an Uber, and I did exactly that, all the way to a life that doesn't need his permission anymore. I don't regret the marriage. I regret how long it took me to notice a shoebox on a high shelf was trying to tell me something, but I noticed in time. I built a paper trail instead of a scene, and a stranger named Hector still gets a 5-star review from me every time I open the app, because he was the first person who ever showed me what it looked like to be taken care of without having to ask twice. Some nights when Levi's finally down and the townhouse goes quiet the way it does, I sit in that silence and let it be exactly what it is now. Mine. Chosen. Not something anyone told me to have.